Thank you, Judy. As unaccustomed as I am to this, you bear with me today. First, I want to thank you for the privilege of being asked to contribute something to your beautiful calendar. And I'm happy also that North Hudson will get a little recognition for this. Having studied the history of North Hudson, we haven't always been that welcome in Hudson until they really wanted us in Hudson, and then we didn't want to come to Hudson. That's another story, all these annexations that they had. And it's so nice to see all of you gardeners. You beautify the city and you beautify our lives. And thank you, how appropriate that our subject is the Italians, who were gardeners extraordinaire. First, I want to introduce to you my daughter, Lonnie Jacobs, who's going to run the slide. She is also a master gardener, and she has been my encouragement during these talks. Are you ready? We're going visiting this afternoon, and we're going to North Hudson to a neighborhood, an Italian neighborhood in maybe the 30s, 40s, or 50s. You will relive with me a visit I made in the early 80s. We will make one stop at Josephine Zappa Madden's house. At our knock, the door is opened by a petite, smiling, and beaming Italian lady who, with a sweeping gesture, says, "Come in, come in." And first of all, we notice the wonderful smell in her kitchen. And before we say, we are here to learn how it was in Italy before you came to America, and what you thought of this country that was to be your new home. She says, very good, but first, we'll have coffee. Do you like coffee? And I made pizzelles for you to have with our coffee. She really did that. Pizzelles are that wonderful Italian cookie that they make on a pizzelle iron. As we sip our coffee and eat the pizzelles, we chat. Now, upon leaving this pleasant place, she says, "Oh, but wait a minute. I have for you a bag of pizzelles for you to take home." I had never met the lady before. Italian hospitality, other times you'd go home with a bag of peppers or maybe some cheese. We will learn a little later in the hour what we chatted about. Now we have you up there in North Hudson. This talk is about a neighborhood, an Italian neighborhood, and its people in North Hudson. There have been other ethnic neighborhoods in Hudson. First, of course, there was the French and the Indian. When the first family settled here, Louis Massey and Peter Boucher in 1838, they built their first huts and log homes on the shoreline of the Willow River, which ran along the west side of this newly ceded Indian land. They settled on the south side of what became St. Croix Street and west of First Street. Now, north of St. Croix was already established an Indian settlement on the bluff, just west of First Street. On the corner, on the very northwest corner of Hudson, overlooking the Willow and the St. Croix rivers. It looked somewhat different then because there were no dams. No dams had been built on any of the rivers at that time. Then in the late 1800s and early 1900s, Hudson had a large German population. And they had, at that time, had an annual German picnic. And that was held on the shores of the pond, or Malibu, on the south side, which was later named Lake Malibu. And everyone was invited, and everyone came. Speeches were long, extolling their patriotism and their citizenship. Recognitions were made, food was plentiful, and the beer flowed. On the north side of Hudson, there was a ravine, now named Division Street, and that was called Swede Hollow. So we've had other nationalities, but North Hudson had the longest lasting ethnic prairie community of Italians. And that was sometimes referred to as Little Italy. The North, I don't remember it being called that, but other Italians, when they left home, and they refer back to home, would call it that. The great waves of Italians entering the United States beginning in 1880 met great challenges. Organized labor was hostile to the unskilled foreigners. and nevertheless, more than 4 million Italians managed to make a new home in America. 285,000 of them in 1907 alone. And they established their old world way of life, frequently in close-knit little Italian communities, such as Cumberland and later Hudson. There was discrimination against the Italian when he arrived. The press was not friendly, but these immigrants were necessary to build this new world. We had just had the Louisiana Purchase. Before that, America was small. Then this vast country opened up in the West, and what were they going to do with it? So they had to explore it, and they didn't have the people to do the work that was required. Now, the Irish and the Italians were to the railroading industry what the Scandinavians were to the logging industry. They were vital to both. The Italians came from a predominantly Catholic country to a predominantly Protestant country. They were wine drinkers, and the common drink here was beer. But there was plenty of good water, unlike southern Italy. A striking difference they learned was that bartering was not the method of exchanging goods or services. Everything had to be paid for in cash, so though they earned $1 or $2 a day, it was quickly spent. But the main thing was having enough food for a large family, the American dream, and the very reason they came here, to improve their economic lot in life. The vast majority of Cumberland's and North Hudson Italians were from some small communities in southern Italy, such as Campobasso, Adelita, Calabria, and Sicily. The language barrier, the new country with its different customs, and the necessity to work at hard laboring jobs kept them on the bottom of the ladder. The fact that they were called Dagos and Wops in the press, behind their backs and to their faces, was, to say the least, demeaning. All of these things made it easier and necessary to stay together. They were watched by the townspeople while at work and while at school and at the St. Patrick's Catholic Church. Their early shyness in public was gradually overcome, and as they became known, they were accepted, well-liked, and respected. They have contributed greatly to the community and to Hudson. Surely North Hudson would never be the same without them. Now, the Cumberland group consisted of about 150 families who were mainly dairy farmers and cheesemakers, and they excelled in cheeses such as Asiago, Provolone, Parmesan, Ricotta, and Gorgonzola. One Italian lady told me that they cooked in a fireplace in their home in Italy. So when she came here and walked into Aunt Rose's, she couldn't imagine what that big black contraption was in the kitchen, which was the stove. They did continue to prepare their foods in the same way they had in Italy, and not too unlike the early American methods here of preserving in open crocks their peppers, green tomatoes, and cabbages. They made their own sausages and dried them. They were very self-sufficient. When the first Italians came to Cumberland and Barron County in the late 1880s, Cumberland was a lumberjack and a railroad town. And according to a WPA survey, the town was one of the toughest lumber camps in Wisconsin. A member of the notorious quartet, Cumberland, Hurley, Hayward, and Hell. The first three, it was said, were tougher than the last. We have to remember that. The fact that there were jobs and inexpensive land of 10, 20, or 40-acre pieces available drew the Italians. One Italian lady told me that in Italy, a 10-foot square garden was about what they had in the mountainous region that they lived in. So they didn't know what to do with these large pieces of land. Most of the land was cut over forest land, full of stumps that had to be removed to make it farmable. The men worked 9 months of the year on the railroad section all over the country for the railroad. And the other 3, they were removing stumps. Bob Williamson reminded me that the trains that traveled that pinery area were called stump jumpers. The Spooner train was called that, and he said the people from that area were called stump jumpers also. The Italians lived in the railroad shanties and the log cabins until they could build their frame homes. There was strict segregation. The Italians lived south of Highway 63. It was risky if they ventured north of that. And one WPA Commission report concluded in 1911, the Italians were, among other things, foreign, clannish, superstitious, suspicious, ill-tempered, prone toward fighting, wielding knives, etc. Some of their treatment would have encouraged some of those attributes, but I won't go into that now. Remember, this is a time of Cumberland, Hurley, Hayward, and Hal. It was rough. The times were really rough. The Italians came to Hudson in early 1900s to work for the Omaha Railroad Car Shop Company, where they repaired railroad cars, and later they made new cars. I was told that an Italian working on the railroad section around Cumberland was told there was work to be had in the car shops at North Hudson. A clipping from 1905, Hudson Star and Times, under the column headed North Side Narration said, "About 50 Italians are camped in the Omaha yards over near the Loban place. They work for the company for $1.40 a day, sleeping in the company's cars, and eating such rations as they could produce for themselves." You know, the shops had an attraction for all the men in town, and most of them, at one time or another, worked there. Some of their employment was short-lived because of the many layoffs, at which time they would go and get another job. It was like a man thing, working with that big iron and to work with those big trains, those wonderful trains that fascinated everyone. The Italians found it difficult living in Cumberland and working here, so they eventually moved here. And early on, many living with their relatives. They settled on the north end of Highway 35, beginning about at Monroe Street, on the outskirts of town then. Highway 35 was a sandy, dusty, ruddy road that went through North Hudson on the way to Stillwater. Some of the older Italians never mastered the English language. They spoke Italian exclusively at home, and the next generation spoke it less, and the last none at all. Their early homes, as Tony Zappa once reminded me, were built of shop lumber covered with tar paper. The few blocks were called Tar Paper Alley or Tar Paper Avenue, depending on whom you spoke. The ladies liked the avenue. Their places were very neat, and they only lived in these until better homes were built. They had wonderful gardens with long rows of endive, spinach, green and red peppers, tomatoes, peas, Swiss chard, cabbages, beans, pickles, and potatoes. In early times, they were approached by the Scandinavians and the Germans for their seedlings of the tomatoes and peppers that they had started early in their hot boxes. After canning for their winter use, they sold and gave away the surplus. The Italians could harvest more on less land because they labored early and late in their gardens. They could be seen in the village delivering the produce, which early on the women would carry in their aprons. Otherwise, they stayed closer to home. In 1922, there was a national railroad strike. This yard was affected too. Well, the first influx of strikebreakers were Italians from Cumberland. This set a barrier between their countrymen and themselves. They lived literally in the boxcars of the railroad company, which is how they were easily moved in and out of the shopyard at night, unseen by the pickets. A sneaky way, but not beneath the railroad practice. According to Jim Burt in an article on the Hudson shops, he said that the shops was unionized in 1902. The men here struck 4 times. The first 2 in 1902 and 1907 were resolved overnight to their satisfaction. Inflation sparked the 1919 strike that ended in 2 weeks, but a nationwide strike started in July of 1922 involved 400,000 workers and 6 different crafts: blacksmiths, boilermakers, electrical workers, and carmen. The Labor Board approved a 13% wage cut. This strike coincided with a soft coal miners' strike. And between them, Jim said they grabbed every headline in the St. Paul papers for 2 months. In Hudson, friendships went by the board. Some never mended. Bitterness heightened because the foremen were not cut. The strike began in July, ended in on September 14th. The strikers raged at their replacements with fists and barrel staves. Nuts and bolts ricocheted off of the brick walls. The railroad had control over the workmen who were completely dependent upon them. There were some shopmen that chose to scab and this brought much animosity among the strikers, the townspeople as well. Some were their neighbors. After all, the livelihood of the city of Hudson depended on the employment of the shopmen. There was violence. People carried guns. The women, too, would stand at the railroad fences and gates shouting at the scabs. The families of North Hudson at that time, I have to leave this a little minute, I was told, pooled their food. No one had worked in 2 months. They pooled their food and in the old schoolhouse, and they made a meal, and everyone came there to eat. The prairie consisted of more than a few families, and I'm going to profile the first family that came here, and that was the Ritchies. Anthony, old Tony Ritchie, the patriarch, was born in 1855 in Adelita, Daquila Province, near Naples. When he was 21 years old in 1876, already married to his wife Carmela, he came to this country for the first time. He returned to Adelita several times, but the last time he returned in 1889 with his wife and his 6-month-old son, Eugene. He settled in Cumberland, where his family was among the very early pioneers of the community. 5 more sons were born to him: Joe, Dominic, Frank, Felix, and Angelo. Angelo was known as Bing. I don't know if there's any of you here remember any of those Italians. I do. Eugene was the 6-month-old baby that came from Italy and the first Italian to come to North Hudson. He went to the Omaha car shops, applied for, and got a job. Soon followed his brothers, and then came the others. And that was the beginning of the Italian community. Eugene came in 1907. He was 21 years old. He apprenticed and eventually became a blacksmith and worked with my father in the blacksmith shop. He worked for the railroad 32 years. Gene became active in civic affairs, and he was North Hudson Village Assessor in 1925. He was on the ticket committee for the ski tournament here in February 1929. Internationally known skiers came here, mainly from Norway, as well as all over the States. The ski scaffold was located on the east side of Muddy Bend and on the eastern hill on Riverside Drive. A prearranged special ski train brought the crowds here to view these ski tournaments. Gene operated a little store in 1929 near the Delmonico Garage on the corner of Monroe and 35, where the Seasons Tavern is now. He was also on the village fire department. Now, the fire department was formed of shopmen in the shops, and when a fire was reported, the shop whistle would blow, which was heard all over the valley if during a work day the men were excused from work to fight the fire. Oh, when that whistle blew outside of a sequence, everyone got excited. We knew something bad had happened. It wasn't only for fires, but mainly. So everyone took notice because everyone lived by that whistle that blew. In 1920, Gene was the North Hudson school treasurer. And more interestingly, the school minutes reveal that in 1913, he watched the school in the grounds on Halloween and was paid $1.50 for the night. It was important to do that because they had the outside biffies for the girls and the boys, and that was the main target of the Halloween pranksters, and to keep them from soaping the windows of all the windows in the school. He married Caroline Ranello, and they had 9 children: Mary, Herman, Annie, Eugene. Now, Eugene was in the Navy and was killed in the South Pacific during the war in 1944. Frances became a nun at Fond du Lac. Elsie, who married Bill Mulvaney. Margaret married Joe Budke, or Maggie, as some of you know her. Louis, known as Louis, and Sammy. Now, Sammy Ritchie was a friend of George Mikan, a member of the Minneapolis Lakers basketball team. And Louis remembered when George and his teammates came over, they had to bend over when they came into the Ritchie house for dinner. Sammy became a teacher, lived and died in Florida. And Victoria married Anthony Withuski. The family lived at 542 6th Street North. Joseph Ritchie, his brother, followed him, becoming a carman, and was with the railroad 49 years. He was a member of the village fire department in 1924, and he was the first one to have a popcorn wagon in 1932, and that remained popular for many, many years in town. Joe died of a heart attack while fishing from a boat which overturned on Perch Lake. He married Sam DeBruzy's sister, Mary Ann, and they had 8 children: Minnie, Caroline, Tony, Frank, Mike, Esther, Peter, and George. Now, George was active in sports. In high school, he excelled in academics, as well as basketball, football, and boxing. He was drafted for the service in 1943, and he married Joan Ryan, and they are the parents of Kitty Ritchie Rhodes, once our state representative. Brother Dominic came next, 2 years later, and he became a crane operator for the railroad and worked there for 40 years. He married Rose DeBruzy, and they had 6 daughters: Phyllis, Louise, Peggy, Catherine, Dolores, and Evelyn. Frank followed and finally worked as a machinist in the shops from 1918 to 1956, when the railroad shops closed in North Hudson. He and his family lived at 408 6th Street North. He worked there 38 years, and following that, he worked 8 years for the Gagnon Construction Company, finally becoming a maintenance man for the Village Hall in North Hudson. He said when he came, there were only 3 Italians here, and they were brothers. The population was about 300. North Hudson has grown. Frank was interviewed by a high school girl and revealed a lot of North Hudson history. He said there were a lot of nationalities that worked in the shops: Swedes, Norwegians, Germans, and I know there were French and Irish as well. They built their homes nights and on Sundays, helping each other. On August 11, 1927, while a ball game was in progress, the fire alarm sounded. And Leo Muckenhern, who was the first baseman, was also the fire chief. So they hastily abandoned the game for a few minutes and the spectators all followed as well. The fire was in the basement of the Frank Ritchie house and was soon put out, and they went back to the field and the game was resumed. In 1934, there was a flood in the spring, and the bridge to Hudson, if that slide is up, that was some bridge. That's the bridge we used to use going between North Hudson and Hudson. This is going into Hudson. Oh, did I do that with my hand?
Yep, you might want to keep your hands.
Oh, I'll keep my hands down. But that bridge was washed out with a great flood. So when that went, they built sort of a footbridge so the kids could go back and forth to school and the people that wanted to walk and use the bridge to go back and forth to work. But if you wanted to drive downtown, you had to go through Stillwater or out through Burkhart to get to Hudson while that bridge was gone. Then they built, the Depression years were on, and there was a tension as to who was going to be hired to work on the building of the new and present bridge over Malilu. On May 9th, 1934, married men were put on a list to work for the new county bridge. Among them were 6 Italians: Tony Ritchie, Joe DeBruzy, Jim Zappa, Tony Ritchie, Herman Ritchie, and Herman Schulo. He said he lived close to the shops, Frank did, so he could go home for dinner, and he could sleep until 7 o'clock in the morning and still get there before the whistle blew at 7:30. He remembered that when they built the new high school in 1917, it is now Willow River Elementary. Move it again. He said as far as Italian history in Wisconsin went, Cumberland and Hudson were really the only 2. There were a few at Spooner. There were some 20 ice houses here at one time in North Hudson, making ice out of Lake Malilu. He said the Duffy Harrison family owned the Point off Riverside Drive. He spoke of all the feuds between Hudson, Bayport, Stillwater, and North Hudson. Well, this, you know, was all the young men. And if one got a girlfriend in Bayport or Stillwater, the Hudson boys were after those guys and vice versa. So there was a lot of scrapping, but fighting with your fist was popular then, so the boys all thought they were prize fighters. I remember that. When he first came here, he said people used to say, "How about that Hurley, Stillwater and Hudson?" Stillwater and Hudson got added to that. There were fights all the time, and when the lumberjacks would come down here, taverns did a big business in the spring of the year, and when the sawmills started up, there used to be a big sawmill in Buckeye. He told how the St. Croix River was so plumb full of logs that to go fishing there, they would take a bar along to open up the logs and fish between the logs and then get all the fish you wanted. He spoke of the great shop picnics held at Hudson, Cumberland, Spooner, Shakopee, Savage, River Falls, and Ellsworth. They took in the whole Omaha Road. The railroad company furnished the train to transport the people and their picnic baskets in the many passenger cars of the special picnic train. The picnic would last all day with races and programs. They were very popular, but he said they began to die down, then they ceased altogether. He said there were about 800 in the shops before World War I. Frank played the accordion, and a couple of people from Cumberland would come down, and I think one played the fiddle. I don't know what the other one played. And they would roll back a carpet in the house. They would sit in the corner, and the party was on. They had a lot of those. As for the village, he said the city of Hudson did not want North Hudson while they had the toll bridge. But when that ceased, then they wanted the village to join them by annexation. As I said before, that's another long story. Frank married Sam DeBruzy's sister Clara, and they had 4 daughters, Lucy, Rosemary, Eleanor, and Florence, and they were all my age. Felix, the 5th brother, was not going to be left behind, and he joined his brothers, and he gave the railroad 40 years of his service. He was a village constable in 1933, but he was killed in an automobile accident on Benoit Hill, east of Hudson, in 1955 at the age of 55. He married Rose Callagher, and they had 5 children, Dorothy, Reuben, Patrick, Ernest, and Philip. Now, some of these are still here. His grandson, Scott, son of Reuben, had this to say in an article in the Minneapolis Tribune in 1984. Rumor has it that Antonia, that was his grandfather, the patriarch, was christened an American when he and many other Richies who settled in Wisconsin began working for the railroad. Seems the paymaster couldn't keep them all straight, so he gave them, Antonia and a few others, the choice of taking a new name or finding a new job. When they all came there, R-I-C-C-I, and then they changed it to R-I-C-H-I-E. I don't know how that solved the problem, because there were that many I-C-H-I-Es as there was the other. But that's when they claimed they had changed their name. Money was talking. Antonio didn't know English, but he listened to that. So they changed their name. My father, Reuben, never spoke Italian. Scott is talking here. He said, my father never spoke Italian in front of us because he knew our kindergarten teacher wouldn't like it. He never made a big deal out of eating homemade linguine, sausage, and ravioli. He just ate it smothered in hot peppers. He didn't dress in red, white, and green or wear an Italian horn around his neck. But we sensed that we were just as Italian as the DeBruzys and the Lambertas and the Shulos and the Zappas. So they were proud of their heritage. They came from the old country. Reuben's brother Patrick was outgoing and well known in the Twin Cities as well. He had a business downtown St. Paul. He became president of the St. Paul Civic Commission, the St. Paul Club. He belonged to the Bloomington Lions Club, the St. Paul Minuteman, the National Riflemen, the KCs, the Ducks Unlimited. He was once a member of the Vulcan crew of the St. Paul Winter Carnival, to the pleasure of many. I believe you have a picture of the football team up there. Pat is there along with a lot of other Italian boys in 1943 football team. The one circled in blue, though, is my brother, Richard Dewey or Dick Cronk. But we grew up with them, as you can see. So this was fun for me to go into this research. I was going back into memories. Pat performed as a Vulcan. He was an avid sportsman involved in the St. Paul Open and the Minneapolis Golf Classics. He started the Pat Ritchie Celebrity Golf Tournament in Indian Hills in Stillwater. 33 years he worked with the Minnesota State Hockey Tournament. And there was more. Oh, he was all personality. Before moving to the city, he was active here at home, and among other things, he put on the Hudson High School football banquets and was the MC of the Pepperfest for years, to mention a few before he died at the age of 67. Gene Ritchie's brother Angelo, known as Bing, was the youngest and the last to come here. He worked at the shops until 1934, and he married Filomena Discola. He had 6 children: Paul, Carmela, Virginia, Marie, Anne, and Violet. He died at the age of 68. They weren't so long-lived, were they? The Ritchie family was the largest family to come here, with the exception of the Zeza family. The Ritchie parents, Tony and Camilla, after 30 years of farming near Cumberland, came here to be near their sons and their families. And yes, Tony got a job with the company and worked there for 8 years. So the father and 6 sons were all employed at the same time for the Omaha Railroad in as many capacities. I figured them as a family. They dedicated 230 years of loyal service to the railroad company. That's a significant contribution. Their mother was known to all as Grandma Ritchie, and she was a familiar figure in North Hudson in the 1920s and 30s. She was a small, wiry person who could be seen walking along the road. There were no sidewalks, knitting as she went, carrying a basket on her head, as was the custom in the old country. She would stop and visit with people she knew along the way. Her 6 sons produced 37 children in North Hudson. They went to parochial school and high school in Hudson. I remember her coming to our house one time to give us a round white cheese that she made. It was so excellent and so delicious. She could understand English, but she couldn't speak it. And she was animated as she understood us and would say, "Yeah, yeah, yeah," shaking her head and understand. Her granddaughter Elsie would be with her and would translate for her. Oh, she would have such a good time. Anthony died in 1941 at the age of 86, and his obituary said, "The death of Mr. Ritchie ends the career of another western Wisconsin's early settlers and a progenitor of a fine family. He was a highly respected resident of the community." Grandma Ritchie died in 1944 at the age of 87. Alphabetically, there were the DeBruzes, another industrious family of 2 brothers, Sam and Joe, and their sister Ann. The DeBruzes took over the popcorn wagon from the Ritchies. This was during the 30s and 40s, and since then they have opened cafes and nightclubs, liquor stores, and of course the DeBruze Masonry Company, which Papa Joe operated for over 30 years. Sam DeBruze was born in Cumberland in 1898, same year as my father. He came to North Hudson when he was 18 years old in 1916, and he remembered that there were wild woods north of Michelson Street at that time. There were 6 to 8 Italian families here, and there was 1 mill by the big dam and 1 mill by the little dam at that time. He worked on the annual ice harvest. He was on the village board when the St. Croix Street put in sewer and water. It went to Lemon Street, and Otto Swanson and he circulated a petition to property owners to donate land for the street. Now, old Tony Zappa put up a fence trying to stop the street from going any further. He said he lost the next election, Sam did, to young Bill Williamson. He recalled that in those days, Ernie Starr's bar was a pool hall, sold pop, and did a little bootlegging. I have to leave my script for a minute. That little bar went with the election. If they voted dry, he was a chicken shack. But the back was wet. And when they voted wet, he was a bar. I think everything operated always the same, but anyway, that was the official. He said a group would get together and start on Sunday a.m. and Sunday night a house would be up. He said there was a gang of them and the house was already cut, and on the Jim Crowley house the studs were all cut and the roof was shingled before they put it on. When a house was done, they'd have a housewarming. The girls would furnish the lunch and the men furnished the pop and paid for the accordion player. They often had these get-togethers at different houses. Wintermeyer's was one, and Crowley's, and others. We would dance all night, he said, and we'd go home at 5 o'clock in the morning, change our clothes, and go to work. He worked as a painter for the Omaha until the shops closed in 1956. That year he was named King of the Pepperfest. I thought they were still, maybe that was the time they changed from Godfather. They used to call the king the Godfather. and then they changed it to the king. The following that year, he was employed as a car salesman at Anderson Chevrolet in Hudson. He made a good car salesman, too. And after that, he became a maintenance man at Hudson Memorial Hospital until 1970 when he retired. But then he worked part-time at Afton Alps Ski Lodge. He was active in the Pepper Festival. I don't think he could stop working or talking, but he was a nice man. Over the years, he was a trustee for the village in 1932 and 1945 to 47. In 38, he was one of the witnesses for Antonio Zappa when he became a citizen of the United States. They all enjoyed that. His wife, Lizzie Seriani, in 1962, won a blue ribbon for her Blue Warrior African Violet at Donaldson's and Golden Rue flower shows in Minneapolis. Those were two very prominent department stores comparable to Macy's today. So that was quite an achievement for her. They had 9 children. Now Samuel, the son, was lost when he went down with the ill-fated Thresher submarine 200 miles off the coast of Cape Cod in New England on April 10th, 1963. His son Albert was a newsboy and rose to become vice president of the First National Bank in Hudson. Jimmy, or James, became a Catholic priest. There were Frank, Caroline, Lucy, Doris and Dorothy were twins, and Margaret. Sam died in 1989. 2 of his sisters were Carmen, who married Jack Muckenhern, and Angeline, who married Fred Linehan. Brothers, he had Joe, James, and Tony. Joe DeBruzzi married Ann Shulo and had 3 children, Bob, Bill, and Janice, and they're among us today, who are out around town. They lived at 508 6th Street North. Papa Joe, he came to be affectionately called, started work in the WPA, the Works Progress Administration, during the 1930s, begun by President Roosevelt. It was a recovery program instituted during the Depression years, and he was excavating the Hudson Underpass at the north end of Hudson 2nd Street using a horse-drawn team and buckets. He became known for his homemade food, especially sausages, which they sold commercially in this area. They played an important part in the North Hudson Pepper Fest since its inception more than 50 years ago. He was the godfather in 1975, and he once said, "I have lived all my life in one block in North Hudson, moving from one house to 3 doors down." I worked for the CSTP M&O railroad shops in North Hudson, and for 35 years owned a masonry business. I retired and turned the business over to my son, Robert DeBruzzi, and his sons. In 1939, Joe made the front page in this article. Between 8 and 9 o'clock a.m. while attending church, the 1936 Ford, purchased 2 weeks earlier, was stolen and ultimately used in a robbery. The thief was caught after robbing 2 filling stations, one in Deer Park and one in Spring Valley, Wisconsin. That Ford got around. His wife, Ann, was known for her cooking skills and authentic Italian recipes handed down from the family. She acquired celebrity status cooking at the Pepperfest and the legendary smorgasbord at Sam's Restaurant. Their son Robert, to mention a few of his achievements, helped construct the model of the new school building. He was and is a railroad buff. He volunteered doing odd jobs around Hudson Hospital during school vacations and attended college in River Falls. He was a bowler attending bowling meets in Detroit and other places. He held an office in the Hudson J.C.'s. He owned duplexes, was a partner with his brother Bill in the DeBruzzi Village liquor store in North Hudson. Bob was a partner with Sam Ritchie in rebuilding Sam's and opening the Brass Track. How many remember that? He and his wife Donna purchased the pool place, adopted a greyhound dog from the dog track. To put it mildly, he was a mover and a shaker. He created a duplicate of the Omaha rail yards and repair shop, as well as a microcosm of parts of North Hudson and Bayport on their line. It's a remarkable achievement, and I'm so impressed. It's a historic treasure. I hope they can find a home for that. It's difficult because it's so large, but it's very important to our history in this area. Ann DeBruzzi Their sister married Russell Nygaard. In 1947, she opened and operated a cafe known as Ann's Cafe here in Hudson. It was at 503 2nd Street. It was a small, narrow, 10 stools, 3 booths that accommodated 21 diners. And it was so popular. When it first opened, coffee was 5 cents a cup, a roll was 10 cents, and a bottle of pop was a nickel. Agnes Scholl was the ace cook. They were known for their pies as well as everything else. In 1956, she and her husband owned and operated a motel and restaurant at Solon Springs, Wisconsin. Later, they purchased the Coast to Coast store in Cumberland, and they returned to Hudson, and they all come back. They returned to Hudson in 1966, and their 2 children were John and Mary Ann. Now there were the Delmonicos. Nick was born in Sicily. He worked in the shops and on the annual ice harvest. He left the railroad to open the North Hudson Auto Company, now on the corner where the bar is now, and the restaurant. Now North Hudson had little commercial business in those years, except the taverns, a little grocery store, and a Sherry's, a miniature department store. The Delmonico Agency was one of the pioneer automobile dealers in the area. He sold new and used cars. He had the franchise for the Star, the Durant, Pontiacs, and Oaklands. And at that time, the Cabriolet and the Coupe were popular. In 1932, he opened Hudson's first city service oil station in the Delmonico garage. Now, Pasquale and Patsy Marino family settled here. His son Felix Marino, in 1932, owned and operated for 28 years the Phillips 66 station. Then it was leased to Lawrence Purcell, and still later to Joe and Lawrence Orskik Zeza. Felix has 2 sons. The Mucci's. It's spelled, as you can see there, M-U-C-C-I-A-C-C-I-A-R-O. I wouldn't know how to say that. Was another industrious family. Jack, the father, was an energetic doer. He worked for the railroad, but he also bought his own truck, and he ran a garbage route, which he operated before he went to work at 7:30 in the morning and after work at 4:30. He was a prize fighter, and he got a lot of press notice about his fisticuffs. He was a farmer, but finally his dream came true. He went to auctioneering school. He was something of a character, but he was so well liked, and I never heard him cry a sale, but I would have loved to. That had to have been entertaining. He had 8 children: Leonard, Nicholas, Rose, Christina, Joyce, Rita, Ava, and John. He had a handsome son, Johnny Jr. He was so personable, friendly, and warm, as those people are. He became quite a successful boxer, too. He was urged to enter the national sport of boxing, and one prize-fighting manager told him, "You'll be a heavyweight champion, not a light heavy. You'll move into the millions like Dempsey and Tunney." He was 5'8", 235 pounds. That was his Pearl Harbor weight. Johnny joined the service, and he became a corporal in the Marines and was captured early in the war, December 9th, 1941, on Guam. And he was a prisoner of war by the Japanese for 48 months, 2 years. He knocked out 18 Japs, that's the vernacular of the newspaper, at one skirmish with his fists. After his experience, he was down to 145 pounds. They tried to stone him to death, but they used him as a stevedore, loading ships. They discovered one day that he had a sock full of sugar strapped to his leg. And as they came to him, he started swinging, and when he was through, there were 18 Japanese knocked out. They lay all around him. The officers could have killed him, but he was such a good worker, they let him live. He became a Marine hero. After his discharge, he appeared on the television show We the People out of New York, telling about his exploits in prison camp. He lived around Boston for a time, where he became a boxer and had lots of success with that, but his first love was wrestling, and he became Mucci the Magnificent. He was killed in an automobile accident in California. The Richies the R-I-C-C-I that kept their spelling. Sam, who was familiar to everyone because of the bowling alley in his recreation center and restaurant and bar called Sam's, was born in Cumberland, and he came to Hudson in 1938. He married Minnie Shulo. Shortly after, in 46, he purchased the garage from Norman Gilbert on the corner, the former Delmonico garage, and began to convert it into a modern tavern. In May the following year, he opened Sam's Bar and announced he would be serving food. His sister Christine Zappa was in charge of the food, with specialties of Italian spaghetti, steaks, chicken, and so forth. In September of 48, Sam opened a bowling alley, 4 lanes on the north half of the building, and oh, was that popular. The same year, in September, he made news in the paper. A safe stolen from Sam's Recreation is found by St. Paul police. $9,000 to $10,000 in cash and checks were missing. After Sammy died in 1969, his wife Minnie and their son Sammy continued with the business until there was a disastrous explosion and fire, which destroyed the business. Young Sam, in 1981, opened on the same location in partnership with Bob DeBruzzi, the Brass Track. The motif throughout was railroad. It never reached the popularity or the success of Sam's, but business has been in operation under different names and ownerships ever since. Today, the restaurant's called Seasons Tavern. There were 2 Shulo families, Sabatino, Sam, and Nicodemus, Nick, both born in Adelaide, Italy, who came here in the early 1900s. Sam served as village trustee in 1942 and 44. His son John was village clerk in 66, and his son George married Peggy O'Connell. Sam had 4 daughters. Betty married Louis Zeza, Sarah married Danny Lixit, and Lorraine married Bob McGrew. The youngest was Mary Jane. Nick Shulo was married in Adelaide, Italy before he came here, and his wife during the war would surprise the Red Cross workers at the school. They had a Red Cross room in the council room at the old school in North Hudson, where they would make bandages and other things for the war. She said, "I cannot make sponges, so I try to help in some other way." She would bring homemade donuts and coffee and nectar. Remember, we didn't have Kool-Aid then, it was nectar, to the volunteer workers. The Red Cross room was held in the council room, and it was closed for good in 1945. The war was over. The Cardarellis, the Danuccis, Lambertus, and the Serianis were also here. The Zappas are a well-known Italian family today. Son Tony Zappa and his family are prominent local businessmen. His son Mark is on the village board at the present time. The patriarch, Tony Zappa, arrived from Italy in 1908 and started work in the coal mines of Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. He said it took him 7 years to save enough money to go back to Italy to get his family. He did return, coming first to Cumberland and then to North Hudson. He settled at 722 Monroe Street on about 10 acres of natural prairie, blow or drift sand the glacier left. And this was the last place out of town. That was way out of town. It's hard to imagine that now. It's a busy intersection. He first worked for the Sioux Railroad Company out of New Richmond, working from sunup to sundown for 15 cents an hour. When he could no longer work on the road, he started at the shops. He had his home wired for electricity in April of 1928. He retired at 70 years of age with a pension of the railroad of $65 a month. He said he sold milk for 5 cents a quart in 1948. It was up to 30 cents in 1970, and the interviewer said she paid 85 cents a gallon. He married Susanna Derma, and they had 8 children. Josephine, our Joe that we visited, Teresa, Tony, Jean, Henry, known as Butch Zappa, Mary, Jim, and Jean. The happy day came for Tony Sr. when he became an American citizen in 1938. As I said, Sam DeBruzzi and Frank Ritchie appeared as witnesses for him. He had definite opinions on political leaders. He did not think much of Hoover, but he had a dog named after him. And he did not approve of Mussolini, the war leader in Italy. He had a brother, Jerome, who lived with him, and he had another brother, Augustine, in Montreal, Canada. The present-day Zappa Brothers Construction Company is from this family, and Tony, Julie, and Jim purchased the Ray Miller Contracting and Excavating Company. Tony has retired, and that company, as well as many of their other business ventures, are now run by his sons. I had an opportunity, and here we go, to visit with Josephine, who was such a petite and so dynamic. She made pizzelles for our treats and coffee. She was born and lived in Adelaide, Italy, and she said her mother and she and two of her neighbors boarded a ship to come to America. She said they all sat at long tables to eat. They were 14 days on the ocean, where it stormed so bad that they had to anchor some of the time. She said she and the kids would run along the railing until they were stopped from doing that. A few of the kids came down with measles and some with smallpox before they landed, so they had to be quarantined at Boston. After some days, they were released and journeyed on to where their father worked. She said when the young husbands were in America, the young wives at home would hoe in the fields and gardens for people, taking their children with them to earn a little to eat. The men would send money back for them to live on also. They first came to Cumberland, where they lived for 2 years, she said. Someone on this section got her dad a job at the shops, and he came home to Cumberland every other week. He said, when we get enough money, we'll move to Hudson. And when they did, she said her father put up a little shed here and another shed there. They had a cow, chickens, and a big garden. She attended the school in North Hudson, and not speaking English, they would let her cousin Minnie come into the room with her and translate for them. Her teachers were Miss Gamble and a Miss Padden, and the teachers boarded at the Roy Dick home. She said the teachers were nice to her, but she could not talk to them. She began the 5th grade in the parochial school. She said her Aunt Rose was a Zappa and married a Zappa, but no relation. She's the one that told the story about visiting Aunt Rose in the black contraption. She remembered how hard her mother worked canning and the big canvas that they threshed the navy beans on that they grew. People from Hudson would come and buy their beans, she said, and it was hard to make it, but her father wanted to pay for his little home. There was another Zappa family in town, Alexander, born in Adelaide, Italy. He was known as Sandy, and he married Christine Ritchie. She was known by Christy. In 1932, Sandy had a roadside stand where he sold cigars, tobacco, ice cream, candy, and soft drinks. In 1933, they established a little grocery store, which also had a bar. In 1930, I remember that. I'm giggling, some memories. Christy's brother Sammy came down from Cumberland to run it for a year or so until he bought his own building. After Prohibition, it was called Sam's. Christy was active in the Women's Relief Corps, and in 1964 represented the state of Wisconsin at national meetings. Sandy and Christy raised 2 of Christy's nephews, Bill and Al Ranello. They had 2 children. Mary Jane married Dick Burnell, and Bill, who married Jenna Bell Haug. Joe Zezza was born in Cambabassa, near Naples, Italy. He came here in 1889, and he and most of his boys worked at the shops at one time or another. He married Antonia Schulo. They married a lot of Schulos. I should figure that out sometime, and if they're all the same family. I wasn't quite aware of that, only now when I say it. They had 10 children. Tony, Lawrence, Tom, Dan, Zezza, Louis, and Joe, who was in 1977 a trustee on the village board and was chairman of the street, sewers, and the water. The family were 5 sons and 5 daughters. The daughters were Lucille, Mary, Laura, Anne, and Madeline. And Madeline was beautiful, and she was so sweet. She would come down when we kids were swimming at our other favorite swimming place. We loved Galahad, but we'd swim under the brand new county bridge. Oh, was that cool. She would come and swim with us. On hot sunny afternoons, we would swim from one creosoted pier to another. The oil slick was on the water from that new fresh creosote. Her brother Dan Zeza became president, more often called mayor, of North Hudson, Hudson Village Council, and he held that position for 26 years, including the year of 1969, the year he died. He had retired from the railroad 2 months previously. He had been a member on the St. Croix County Board for several years, and he was president in 1964 when plans were drawn for a new and present village hall near 7th and St. Croix in North Hudson. The building would house the council chamber, the village offices, police department, and voting facilities, plus space for community functions. He was a pleasant and affable man and well-respected and influential in every other capacity that he held. He had been named honorary grand marshal at the St. Paul Winter Carnival Torchlight Parade, and he rode with that gregarious Greek St. Paul mayor, George Vavilas. You remember him? He received honors from King Boreas Rex, who knighted the North Hudson official as the Lord Mighty One in February 1964. Dan's daughter, Barbara, was an accomplished musician, was representative senior of Hudson High School in '47, had an excellent scholastic record as well in music and speech. In 1948, she was chosen queen of the big and exciting Hudson Centennial Celebration. That was huge for us. His son, Jack, was a popular fellow about town, and among other things, in '76, he owned and operated the Hudson Harbor restaurant. Now, in closing, the railroad company had a practice of offering the retired railroad cars to the employees to be torn down for lumber. This lumber was highly sought after, and this was a great opportunity for them to get good lumber for building, and everyone seemed to have a project going that required that lumber. If not building new, they were repairing. The men that were interested in this would put their name on a list at the shops, and when a boxcar, coal car, or flatbed came in to be torn down, it was backed off on a siding. Maybe in the Darby, an area that was a temporary storage, was just west of Galahad Road at Wisconsin Street. That had several tracks in it and had been used in the logging days where the cars would come in. They would bank the logs, roll the logs off the trains, and they would bank them there in the wintertime, so in the spring they could roll them off and they'd go down to St. Louis or wherever they went. Or there was another yard that was up near Summer Street on the north end of the shop yard. The men watched this list to see if their name was coming up, and they were given 10 days to have the car torn down. Oh, it was dirty, hot, hard work. Some cars provided more lumber than others. The car sills were highly sought after, and these prize sills ran the length of the boxcar. They're about 8 by 10 or 8 by 12 feet long. Sometime the name on the list would not take the car they offered, or someone else it would go to the next name. Some of the men helped each other tear down, and the wood was valuable, and most of the homes in North Hudson and Hudson, the farmhouses and barns in the township, had shop lumber in them. And also treasured was the outside sheeting on a boxcar. They called the shops the North Hudson Hardware. It provided paint if you liked gray, and upholstery material if you weren't fussy and used red and green. All manner of other hardware and lumber was available too, evidently. One enterprising Italian made it a business to see whose name was on the list. And he would see if they wanted the car offered them. If not, he would have them sign for it anyway, and he would tear it down. He had huge piles of sills, other good lumber denailed, sorted, and stacked in his backyard. He would sell this lumber, and his niece told me that is how he made a lot of money. Well, the local lumberyard in Hudson knew of this. They claimed they were losing money, so they complained to the railroad company. The railroad company reprimanded the Italian, and the cars were no longer offered to the men. The Italians remained a close group for the most part. In the late 20s and 30s, they entered local politics, still they married outside their nationality. The early prejudice and discrimination of those hardworking and loyal Italians was disappearing. The Italians were an integral part of the North Hudson history. Their involvement in the Pepperfest is evident of that today. It originally was a combined effort to raise money to build a new public elementary school. The entire village worked together in the 50s when a carnival was held in the old schoolyard between 4th and 5th Street, not on the prairie. And I apologize for this poor picture, but I thought it would give you an idea of what the old school looked like a little bit. But the carnival was held in the schoolyard for a couple, 3 years. An Italian wrote to Julius La Rosa, the popular singer at the time on the Arthur Godfrey Show, for a donation of some article for the auction. He sent a record, and oh, there was much ado over that. But Liberace also sent a curio in the shape of a piano, and they got the huge sum of $400 at that time for that. It was a great festival featuring many Italian foods prepared by the ladies and served inside the old school building, and I'm told it was the one that made the most money. The school was built on the prairie, and the carnival has continued to raise money for deserving organizations, but now called the Pepper Festival. Italian foods are the big feature in the drawing card. The ladies of the village and the city spend months, even today, we read in the paper, making and freezing the raviolis, meatballs, sauce, peppers, and other Italian dishes. When pizza first came to town, it was a sensation. I remember that first pizza shop, and it was busy. But I don't know how many people went around town with their upper mouths burned from that hot cheese. I was one of them. Elsie Ritchie Mulvaney told me she couldn't understand the popularity of pizza. They seldom made it at home. The prairie has been developed. The Sandburr acres are covered. I'm taking these from other parts of the story that I can't tell you today. I want to keep it close to an hour. The Sandburr acres are covered with homes, and Bull Prairie has disappeared. The Italian community has become dispersed, but their former presence and contributions are an everlasting heritage to North Hudson. They were not only Italians, they were our friends and neighbors and loved ones. Now, 100 years after their first coming here, we are seeing the way Mike Ritchie, once a member of the Hudson Township Planning Board, saw it, and he said to me, "But you know, there aren't very many of them around here anymore." And now, sadly, neither is he. I hope you've learned something about a former thriving community in North Hudson. Their children are about my age. Some of them and their children and grandchildren are among us today, but I don't know who they are. Sad to say. Thank you for coming. It's rewarding to think there are so many are interested in our awesome history. Thank you.